I'm excited to be here and to kick us off. So we had kind of an interesting problem for simulation that's a little bit different than what we had seen before. We wanted to talk today with you guys about it, and in particular the challenges that we found with this problem. But we thought maybe you guys might see, maybe you haven't seen yet, but how did we approach them and how could you approach them in your work? So really quick for the agenda, we'll give a quick overview of the business process. So what are we trying to do? What were some details? I'm going to go through them kind of quick, but I want you to understand what problem we were trying to simulate, why we used AnyLogic, and what's really cool about that is 2 people have already asked questions that go to why we chose AnyLogic. So it's kind of neat to hear you guys ask that. What were our challenges? We have 4 challenges. How did we approach them? How did we solve them with this simulation or the benefits? And then we'll have a quick demo of the simulation. Okay, so our problem is a biotech startup. This is a startup who is doing a treatment that is personalized per the individual patient. This is for a terminal condition. These patients are very, very ill, and this is the last step really for them, the last phase for them. It is in testing clinical trials right now. It is not a treatment widely available, so it is an experimental treatment for these patients, but it might be their last chance to get treatment. So because it is personalized medicine, that means you cannot get economies of scale. So in a normal manufacturing environment, you can batch things through, like contact lenses. You've got these giant batch sizes, right? And you're sending them through. In this case, every single product is personalized, customized. It's completely different per the patient. So you can't get those economies of scale. And so what the company wanted to do is to say, let's do something data-driven, using simulation, using optimization, so that we can improve our decision-making, in particular for the manufacturing process that we're working to develop. And this is a process that isn't done yet, because they're still in clinical trials, so they actually don't know what their final process will look like until they get their FDA approval to go into production. So what were the goals? So we want to be able to develop a simulation of their future system, because again, the system doesn't exist yet. What you use for clinical trials is not necessarily what you're going to use when you go into more of a production mode in terms of like a pharmaceutical manufacturing. So how can we evaluate process changes as they go through the trials? They're actually changing the process all the time. They're getting feedback. Some patients are not doing so well with it. Some are doing better, so they're adjusting things with that, trying to improve their process as they go through and try to get approval. How are we going to schedule the plant? This is a manufacturing facility, so it's a very advanced, technical, very expensive manufacturing facility, but it's still a manufacturing facility. You still need to schedule it just like you guys normally see. You've got operators, you've got resources, and how are you going to schedule all of that and plan it? And then what is your capacity planning? So all of the same issues that you have in a manufacturing environment, normally you have here. It's just, it's very expensive, it's very customized, it's very experimental. It doesn't exist yet. And so with the simulation, we can test all of this. And then really important, what are our bottlenecks? Because they want to set up this future manufacturing environment, and they want to be able to go from day one, because their mission is to save lives. So the faster they can get going, the less hiccups in the process, the more lives that they save. And when we sat with them, it was really clear from day one with us that everybody's got this idea in the back of their mind that they could be this is saving someone's life. They could find a cure for someone's disease and save them. And so that was really, it's actually kind of terrifying to do a project with a client who really is life or death. A lot of our projects aren't like that. We do a lot of transportation. People aren't going to die if you cost them a couple of extra miles. But these guys have a very serious mission. They want to get it right the first time. They always want to get it right. They don't have time for failure. And so it makes it really critical to be able to evaluate a lot of this stuff before they go forward with it. And then how scalable is the process? Because clinical trials are very small. They're very expensive. The company actually foots the bill for this. This costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this treatment per person. And so the company's paying for it because of the clinical trials. But when they go into production, they're going to have to charge insurance, or the individuals for this treatment. They're going to have to be able to scale up to reach thousands of people. I mean, clinical trials might have 20 or 30 people in them for a big trial of this sort. And so how do you scale up this manufacturing process that right now you are doing literally by hand, one by one, as they go through? And how can we make manufacturing decisions on all of these things, knowing that no data really exists for this? So those were our goals for the simulation. So again, like I said, in terms of the process, this is customized to the patient's needs. The patient actually provides cellular tissue for this treatment, so it is very custom to each person. What one person would get looks very different from another in terms of the cell makeup. And there are a bunch of sequential phases that I've listed here, so you can see we go through isolate, initiate, transform, grow, finalize, and package. And so we go through all these phases. This actually takes a couple of weeks. So the patient comes in and they give up, they make a donation of their cellular material. It goes through this weeks-long process, and they come back and they get the treatment afterwards. Because of this, they really want to avoid processing delays because these patients, again, are very ill. Some of them, unfortunately, may not be able to receive the treatment because they are so ill. So they want to get it done as quickly as they can, as efficiently as they can, but you have to keep in mind that they are going to productionize this. So at some point, they've got to run it like a real factory while still treating these people who are critically ill and who don't have a lot of time to wait for this. Failures in the system are the biggest no-no. This is the biggest concern they have, is how can we prevent failures? So they have a lot of quality control checks on this. This, again, is going into, like, they have cells and they're doing things to the cells and all this biology stuff. And there's a lot of checks, and especially now in FDA trials there are actually more checks because they're always stopping to check things and do paperwork. So there's a lot of times when they can look at the product and say, ooh, this didn't work. This took too long. It stayed out in this environment too long. It's expired. It got contaminated. It doesn't look effective. When it gets to a failure like this, they actually have to start over. So if you're at the end of a 4-week process and your patient is waiting for it and you have to start over because you delayed that product for an hour and now you've got to throw it away, go back to the patient, get more material and start again, that's a really serious deal to these guys because it's really serious to the patient. And so when we're looking at the simulation, the number one thing we're always saying is no failures, no failures, no failures. Now, sometimes you might have failures because they're just going to happen, but how can we always minimize the failures? And so this was something that you'll really see very heavily in our simulation is checking for failures, trying to prevent failures. How can we make sure this process goes as smoothly as possible? What are the least number of failures that are actually feasible? Because, again, there's always going to be failures, but how few failures are reasonable versus how many are just bad effects in the simulation. So that's our number one goal, is to not have failures. In terms of resources, these machines are, again, very expensive. They're a very scarce cost. They actually, in the facility, had something like 4 to 6 total of the most important resource. This is a resource that's used for like 50% of the process of every product, and they only have 4 to 6 of them in the whole facility right now. So that's a very tight resource utilization. So how can they best use these resources? And that gets into priority because some parts of the process can wait a little bit. You can put it into cold storage and freeze it, and it can stay a couple of weeks. Some parts have to go immediately or you get a failure. And so there's a lot of sharing of resources and saying, okay, who gets this resource next and for what phase? Because if you give it to the wrong person and you cause a failure, that's, again, a very big no-no. And these are very expensive machines. We can't just say, oh, we'll go buy 10 more of these machines. And they take up a lot of space. These are those rooms where people gown into, and it takes like 10 to 20 minutes to get all, they put the booties on, they put the whole thing on, the mask, the gloves. Then they go to another room and they put another layer of this stuff on. And then they go into these very sterile environments. So there isn't a lot of room to add stuff. There isn't a lot of money to add stuff because they're so expensive and so custom to the process. And so this is a very scarce resource, something that we had to work very hard in the simulation and with the scheduling algorithm that we had to be able to handle that properly. Operators were another scarce resource. So these operators are very advanced technically in like bioengineering and biology because they're doing very advanced genetic kind of things with this stuff. And so again, these guys are coming in, they're scrubbing in, they've got to put on all this gear. So it takes about 15, 20 minutes to get ready. They go in this room. Then you can't bring them back out and they undo it and then you say, okay, in 10 minutes you go back in the room. They've got to get dressed again. So there's a lot of setup to go into these rooms. And so you've got to be careful how you're using operators in the simulation to mirror real life because you can't have them going in and out all the time because they just won't be able to get it done with all of the timing around the gear. And they just wouldn't do that, right? But once you put them in there, they have to stay. They can't actually leave legally a lot of this product alone because, again, it's a patient's material. And so there are a lot of regulations around, okay, an operator goes in, they've got to sit there for the next 4 hours with this product while it's being processed. And so we've got to take that into account as well. So how do we do the shifts for these operators such that we're using the minimum number of operators? We're trying not to use overtime. They will allow overtime, but it's very expensive. These are expensive resources. they already work very long shifts because, again, they're in a room for like 4 or 5 hours at a time. So they're working like 10, 12-hour shifts to begin with. So then you ask them to work another 12-hour, that's a lot of overtime. They don't want to do that. They're hard to get these resources. So how can we best use the operator resources as well? And then finally, the facility scheduling. This is a layer added on, and where, in addition to simulating the environment, they're going to need to schedule the production environment. And so we have to schedule the production environment as well. This is a multi-objective scheduling problem, if you guys are familiar with optimization problems. Scheduling problems are kind of tough MIPS to solve if you solve them as a mixed integer programming problem, which is what we did. But you can see we want to minimize failures, we want to maximize resource utilization, we want to minimize process duration because we want to get the product through as quickly as we can so that these patients can get their treatment, and we want to minimize overtime. And a lot of these things are conflicting because if you can let things sit and wait, then you will have less failures. So you've got to find the balance of all of that. So how do we schedule this facility within the simulation in a way that it will run in the way that they expect it to run in real life when they'll be scheduling it? So we did do the facility scheduling as a mixed integer programming model, and there was a question about using an optimization API, which we do use. We use an optimization API for a commercial package in this. And so we've got the simulation being called by the scheduler every time it needs a new schedule. And this is one of the challenges that we'll get into because these run a little bit slower than simulation. If you guys have run your simulations in AnyLogic, you know they run really fast, right? You can run hours or days really, really quickly. Scheduling software does not always run that quickly, and so you're kind of slowing down the process when you insert that. So those were all the pieces of the process that we're trying to simulate. Why did we choose AnyLogic for this? And so this was a greenfield effort in which we said, okay, we'll pick a software for you guys, a simulation API. So we really like the hybrid agent-based and discrete event approach. We find this is really handy for a lot of problems. In this case, the products are agents, but they have a very complicated flow, which we'll see in the demo. So they're going through a lot of blocks. We really think that that helps to have that combined approach. But the number one thing I think that we really liked was that this was written in Java, and we knew we could customize it. So we could bring in a solver API. We could bring in our own packages that we had written. We can call RESTful interfaces, which was another question that we had a minute ago. And we do, not in this particular simulation, but another one where we're actually calling RESTful model APIs, and they're sending us back solutions, and we're sending them back things, and we are communicating in RESTful interface. So we do use a lot of that quite a bit. And also the ability to have the customized framework. And the graphics are really great. Now, unfortunately, this is a simulation in which our client actually said, I don't care what the graphics look like. As you'll see in the demo, I had never had a client say that before where they were like, I don't want a pretty simulation. It was unfortunate, but they were pretty adamant about it. But the AnyLogic graphics obviously are outstanding as well. Okay, so we have 4 challenges that we thought were a little bit unique to this problem and to some of the simulations that we had done, and we kind of wanted to walk through how we solve them because you guys might be facing these challenges as well. So the first one is that the facility doesn't actually exist today, and the process does not exist in its final state yet as well. So when you are simulating an environment that already exists, like we had done a terminal simulation, right? So for those who are in rail, an intermodal terminal, you can go in and just collect all the statistics and the metrics you want, and we've done that. We've gotten the stopwatches out and measured people going through different points, and then we just do some statistical analysis, and we know we baselined it. It's a little more difficult to baseline a situation that doesn't exist. It just doesn't, it's not out there. You can't get these metrics. So how do you know that you're doing the right thing? And when you get weird results, are those because the simulation is wrong, or is it because people, their intuition about the system is incorrect? And actually, a lot of time, it's because their intuition is incorrect. And we see that a lot with optimization. You see it with simulation as well. People really have an idea of how this will work, and it doesn't always work that way. And you've really got to convince them, and we spent quite a bit of time on this particular project. Anytime we had any single failure in the simulation of a product, we had to go explain and prove why that's okay. Like, yes, this happened because X, Y, Z, and that's supposed to happen. So how did we do baselining on a situation that didn't exist? So we started simple. We actually did agile methodology for this simulation. So we built up the complexity in iterations. We had a lot of testing. We actually had a test suite of about 30 or 40 scenarios with different parameter sets that we ran. Every time we made a change, we ran all of those through the simulation. And then we looked at all the key metrics and we said, okay, this used to be 5 and now it's 10. Why is that? Is that supposed to be 10 now, or is that a mistake? Did we have a bug here? We had their SMEs who are very knowledgeable about the system take a look at it as well. But I think having the test cases so you can see the changes iteration to iteration was really key. But you've also just got to be willing to have that give and take with the client. We did a lot of by hand, like making graphs and charts and showing them this is why this is happening, to prove to them that when they saw solutions or results they didn't like, that they didn't think were right, that they actually were correct, and they actually just had the incorrect intuition about it when they had done them. The second challenge is that if you have a lot of timeouts and failures, and you know failures are like no number one, we cannot fail a product, you want to have a lot of buffer in your timing, because not having buffer and having very tight resource utilization will lead to more failures, because of course you're going to get a delay and then you're going to time out there. And so they came in wanting these giant blocks of windows around these resources, which is great for failures. It is not great when you have 4 machines and suddenly you've put an hour on each end of a 4-hour process. Now you've got the machine for 6 hours and it's going to run for 4 hours. And so we actually had to go through and do special constraints to balance this out. But the bigger thing was to run the simulation with a lot of different parameters and to figure out where their risk tolerance was in terms of risk versus reward, of how aggressive did they need to be with these buffers, and find out how much do they really need. Do they need an hour on each side? Can they do 30 minutes and 10 minutes, and would that be enough? And we're able to go through with the experimental framework and do a lot of different experiments to show them what kind of buffer they really needed, which was less than they thought they needed. The third one was that we are moving agents around a lot in the flows, and I don't know if you guys have done that a lot, but if you have to pull them out and start inserting them in different places, sometimes that can be a little bit tricky. You can use dynamic events, hold blocks, timeouts on things to do that. But we also had to make sure that the scheduler did this as well. So there's a lot of timekeeping and record keeping and following where people are in the system so that the scheduler is also producing feasible results. And that was the part that really took us a long time to nail down, how you can move these guys around and still grab all the resources they need and keep all of that flowing. And then the fourth challenge was actually around the optimization, because again, the MIP problem for a scheduling problem in particular is a little bit slow. It'll run in like a second, sometimes a couple minutes. If you're calling it every hour in a simulation and you're trying to run the simulation for 80 days, like without the schedule, it will run really quickly, obviously. When you put the scheduler in, it starts to slow it down. So that's something we saw that wasn't an AnyLogic issue, was actually an issue with our model, and it's just how optimization works sometimes. So how do you combat that where you're actually spending 90% of the time on scheduling and not on the actual simulation run? And we had to get smart about it. We had to say, okay, we're not going to call it every time you want to call it. They wanted us to call it like every hour, every time there was any kind of delay. And we had to get smart about saying what's a delay that matters and will change the schedule, and what won't change the schedule. And how can we see the schedule with a previous solution to make it run a little faster? So I know you had asked the question about putting in scheduling or putting in optimization. It can have an adverse effect. Like it can have a good effect because it optimizes, but it can also affect the runtime, which we definitely saw. The benefits that we achieved, so the biggest benefit is they're actually able to do a decision analysis evaluation on a system that doesn't exist today, and to make make changes and decisions for the future. Sometimes they would come to us and they'd say, we could make this change and it will produce a better product, and we would say, okay, great. You've already got a resource constrained system, now you've made it even more constrained, you're gonna have like 3 times more failures. And they'd be like, ooh, that's not good. Let's go back and rework the process. And so they were coming to us a lot saying, okay, we've moved these steps around, we've grouped these steps, and now they're shorter. What does that look like? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? And that allowed them to focus on those really critical areas that they wanted to tackle of their own process design. We were also able to see what's the throughput they expect. So when they're in clinical trials and they're doing everything by hand and they've only got a handful of patients at a time, they can get more throughput through and they're not that worried about it. When they go into production, they're talking about getting regular scheduled shipments arriving, and what's the timing of that? How many patients' products can they actually get in a week or a month? Is it 10? Is it 100? They had no idea how much they could actually flow through and not result in failures. And so this helped them figure out not only what to flow through, but what, do I accept orders on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday? Do I accept orders on the weekends? Do they all have to come in this window? Because they're coming from around the country. They actually get flown in and land in the airport, come over. If the plane's delayed, that delays things. So what does a schedule look like that they can maintain and get as much as they can in, because they want to treat as many patients as possible, because hopefully they're saving the lives of all those patients. But they don't want to take in so many and promise so many people they can do this, and then it actually causes issues in the facility. And before the simulation, they actually had no idea what that number was, and this gave them that number. And then finally, again, back to the optimization model, it can take months to develop and test an optimization model, like a scheduling model. If you had to do it without a simulation, it's very difficult to do. We actually do a lot of simulations now for clients where we're testing optimization models with them, because it is a great way to really heavy stress test a model that you can't do otherwise. So this saved them months of time. When they're ready to go into production, they've got the scheduling model already done, and they can just implement it as is. So this was actually a big benefit for them, because they knew they have a fast, reliable scheduling model. Okay, let's see if I can. So I wanted to show you guys a demo. As you can see, this is not the most glamorous AnyLogic UI. This is literally just the process flows, and this is exactly what they were so happy with this. They wanted it to look like this, in part because they wanted to show the business SMEs, look, I understand your process because I've got every one of your blocks up here. Because we used to say, can we combine some of this? And they're like, no, no, we've got to keep this all separate. So this was designed by them. They liked it like this. But as you can see, we've got a bunch of different processes. And if I click go, I have this kind of fast, so you can see it since it's going to run for a couple months. You can see the product starts to come through. And it goes in a very linear fashion for the most part. They go from the top, work their way down. One thing they do have is they will split the product a lot. So the product comes in and they do some like biology stuff to it. And then it splits off into two pieces. And those two pieces go through the flows by themselves. And then this last phase, they actually come together and have to be joined back. So there's some waiting on that. So it doesn't look that complicated from here. There's actually a lot in the background written in Java that really is doing the masterminding of it, the scheduling, and what we call the directing of who gets what and when. So the blocks are not really making a lot of decisions. They're mostly just waiting points. But what you can't see this either, but also things are coming out of the blocks and going back in. And so there's a lot of dynamic events in the background. And there's a lot of scheduling pieces to that. Okay? So that is all I had today. Any questions? Discussion? Yes?
Can you elaborate a little bit on integrating the optimization inside your model?
Yes.
Specifically, did you use like a third-party solver, or was it an add-in to the solver?
This is an API for a third-party commercial solver. I don't want to say with solver, but it is one of the readily available commercial MIP solvers, and it has a Java API, has a Groby API. So with the Java API, you just put the jar in as one of the jars in the dependencies, and then you use the API like you would in a normal Java application.
So do you pause your simulation while you're
Yes.
solving the MIP and then get the output as input?
Yes.
To your
So the simulation does pause while it's waiting for it to run. That was the performance issue, because it could take, a MIP usually solves pretty quickly unless it gets into, say, degeneracy and has trouble getting down to the optimality gap. And so you'll see it kind of cycling, trying to get through that. If that takes a while, yeah, the simulation is sitting waiting for that. And so what we'd see is it would run really fast. And I had an easy problem on here so that it would solve really quickly. You didn't see the big gaps in it. And then it might sit there and wait while the scheduler's doing his thing, and then it would start and kick off again. And that was really where we found the performance problems. It's definitely not AnyLogic, it's just waiting. We've done the same thing when we have our RESTful API calls. We wait for it to come back. It's a synchronous call, and that again will cause the simulation to pause.
Thank you.
When the system does go into production, how do you think about ingesting the real-time data or the actual data back into the simulation, closing the gap, perhaps, between the variability?
That's a good question. I definitely think that's an opportunity to then validate what we've done and actually do a real hard baseline on it. They haven't talked about really ingesting it real time. You could definitely do that. The scheduler would be by itself. But I could see them saying, okay, here's our schedule coming up and we have that functionality. So in real time, here's the next 3 weeks. Let's run it through and see what we expect. And then did we actually see that? And that's a really key piece to closing the gap, because right now we can't baseline it in the traditional method of baselining because it doesn't exist. But they could use it, yes, going forward to say, I ran the next 3 weeks. Here's a couple days where I have problems. Let's bump up the operators on that day. Or maybe say, this schedule isn't feasible. You're going to have to cut back one of these shipments. Yes.
First of all, it was a nice presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And my question was on the test suite that you guys have built. Are those functional tests? Or what kind of test suite?
So they were representative scenarios. So some of them were very easy scenarios. Some of them were very hard scenarios. And so they were just 30 or 40 different different parameter changes, different durations for a lot of the blocks, different arrival patterns, like they can come every day, they can come every week, 2 a day, 5 a week, that kind of thing. And so they said, here's the range of what we think we might see in production, and that's how we manufactured all of them. And then we would run them all through every single time and say, okay, which ones look like they're performing differently and why? And sometimes that's expected, and sometimes it's a sign of a bug in the implementation.
It's an end-to-end testing.
It is an end-to-end testing, yep. So run the entire scenario through the simulation.
And where do you store that test? Like, is it inside the model or?
No, so we store it in an external database, and then they each kick through the simulation, like they're a single simulation, puts the results back, and then we have something that goes through and runs through the database and automatically picks out all the ones that we need to take a look at and does the reporting on it.
So this is an operational model of a facility, and it's not something that will be used once and sort of discarded. You'll expect your customer to use it over and over, and as they improve their
Yes.
facility. So have you done anything to kind of make it easier for them to have that input, as opposed to having the consultant always be minding the model?
Yes, that's a good question. So our main sponsor is actually an OR practitioner, so they could do those kind of updates themselves. Something that we propose to them is to make it an easier model to do. If you guys have done, you can do agents that are combinations of process flow blocks, and we haven't done that for this simulation, but we've done it for others. It makes it much easier to make changes. So we have proposed to them some things that they could do to make it a little bit easier for them to maintain. But given that they're OR practitioners, I think they can probably do it, but there are definitely ways, because this was a kind of a complicated flow. It's actually very easy to kind of tweak something and mess it up, and we would like to maybe streamline it a little bit in the future for them. It's a good question.
Dr. Randall here. In the beginning, you called the model a hybrid simulation model. So the process was mostly discrete. What exactly is the agent interaction in the model?
So the main agent is the product itself, and it's going through the flow, so that's one of the agents, but there are a couple of other agents as well. But because they're breaking up and coming back together, that's key to model them as agents. And then there are other things they're doing in the background too as agents, because sometimes there's some logic around moving things out, rescheduling them, that kind of thing, where that's the agent. But in AnyLogic, you've always got one agent, right, at least flowing through the system. That's the main agent, and ours is the product. Oh, okay.
Okay, my question is, I was interested in the benefits analysis that we're doing, and I'm trying to understand, have you looked at cost and ROI or something like that? Do you have any of those insights there?
That's a good question. So we are not doing that particular piece. Our sponsor would be doing that. We actually don't have the cost around these. We know they're very expensive machines, but because they're OR people, they're actually able to do that analysis themselves, and they just asked us to do the simulation and the scheduling pieces. They're definitely doing that on their side and using the simulation to provide the foundation for a lot of that data. But definitely, I'm sure they're thinking about when they're saying how many machines to buy and can we buy more operators. They're doing that kind of analysis using the output of the simulation and the expected results.
Thank you.
You mentioned the scaling rules and algorithms that you were able to validate and verify with this model. So can you give us some idea of how those rules and algorithms look like? So it's not like the precise schedule for each and every situation. It should be more like, in this situation, you might rather want to do this and that. So what do those rules look like?
So some of the rules to make it easy for them. So it is a MIP. So it actually is scheduling every single phase of every product. But they do have rules around how long they will wait for things. So the scheduler knows it can wait 5 days or 5 hours or 5 minutes, whatever. Also, when certain things will happen. So if you saw, each of those swim lanes is a process. And so to help with the operators, what they've said is this process is only going to run from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., right? And this process is only going to run from 12 p.m. until like 8 p.m. But what we found out in the simulation is sometimes that's not feasible, and that's where we would run it through and say, okay, this is a schedule you guys want to run for your operators, but then you get all these failures, and then we've got to make all these graphs and show them why. So those are the kind of heuristics around particularly operator scheduling and when they're going to do big chunks of phases that they were trying to test out and see if they were actually feasible. And sometimes they didn't realize things did not overlap, and then they would actually have failures because of it until they ran it through the simulation. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.